Two major stories broke this week. One is about a Chinese AI lab releasing a highly competitive frontier model for pennies on the dollar. The other is about scientists pulling prehistoric ice from the Antarctic, only to find it laced with microplastics. If you read the standard coverage, you're watching two disconnected crises unfold. The tech sector is scrambling to recalculate a geopolitical arms race, while the scientific community documents another ecological tragedy. Intelligence analysts are beginning to look past the surface of these events. They are finding a shared structural pattern, a specific blind spot hidden in the logic of how we build and measure our most critical systems. Trillion-dollar policies are often built on what analysts call baseline fictions. These are the starting reference points, the foundational assumptions that we treat as solid external facts, but which simply aren't real. When the starting assumption is a fiction, every regulation, every investment moat, and every climate model is optimizing against a reality that does not exist. Let's start with AI. The entire doctrine of U.S. technology policy operates on a single assumption. Building advanced artificial intelligence requires an enormous amount of physical computational power, running on highly specialized, restricted hardware. We built a strategy around that assumption. By restricting the supply of advanced A100 and H100 chips, the U.S. believed it could choke point its adversaries. The strategy treated frontier intelligence like a fortress, protected by defensive walls of high-end silicon. Then DeepSeek published their technical report. They didn't acquire restricted chips. Through knowledge distillation and sparse activation patterns, they reorganized the AI's architecture itself. The capital requirements of the U.S. frontier labs turned out to be a byproduct of architectural inefficiency. DeepSeek demonstrated that the primary competitive moat was built on computational waste, not a physical law. The sanctions targeted a symptom, while the vulnerability was elsewhere. We now have an export control regime perfectly calibrated to defend against a hardware threat model that no longer dictates how intelligence is actually built. The exact same structural failure is happening in global ecology. Look at the international climate frameworks, the sovereign carbon accounting, and the boardroom net zero pledges. This diagram illustrates the basic math driving environmental governance. It's a delta calculation. You take the current state of emissions, subtract a pristine zero baseline from the pre-industrial era, and the difference becomes your policy goal. To find that pristine zero, scientists travel to the most isolated places on Earth, boring deep into untouched ice to measure pre-industrial atmospheric conditions. But the environmental baseline has collapsed. We are finding synthetic hormones in deep ocean fish. We find nitrogen deposition across the Amazon and PFAS compounds inside Arctic polar bears. The pre-industrial reference state was already contaminated before we built the instruments to measure it. Net zero is an arithmetic operation. If your starting zero is wrong, the math is wrong. Every carbon offset market and every ESG compliance framework is performing calculations against a ghost. This creates a massive liability. The frontline science and the policy boardroom have diverged. Researchers are already adapting. They are revising their models to account for novel ecosystems that have no historical analog, and they are finding architectural workarounds instead of relying on brute hardware. They've abandoned the old baselines. Yet the strategic layer is lagging behind. Governments and corporations are still spending billions enforcing AI hardware restrictions and auditing carbon accounts, anchored strictly to baselines that the scientists who designed them are actively discarding. In a landscape moving this quickly, the greatest strategic risk is anchoring models to a fictional starting point. This unexamined assumption creates a systemic vulnerability that remains hidden until the environment shifts. Before you calculate your next geopolitical move or invest capital to defend a competitive moat, you need to ask one question. What is your baseline? And when did you last verify your zero?